So one of the reasons, let me see if I can bring this back, why I found that part of debating rewarding and helpful was first that it gave me the sense that I'm not helpless, right? That with some work, with some effort, with some coaching, it's something that I could make progress on. And furthermore, that this advice that was being presented seemed to get at something true about how it is people change their minds, right? That those are the two things that I think arguments should do at a minimum. There's a lot of different suggestions. I think some of them are coming through that you could do, right? You could be very winning in the way in which you present the argument. You could bring the audience in a deeper way. And all of those things are really important. But at a minimum, these are sort of the two components. So then I kind of rode this journey all the way through school and through university. And I had my biggest triumph in January 2016 when my partner, debate partner, Fanele, and I won the World Universities Debate Championships, where 500 teams from all over the world compete. And if I wrote the book then, and I was approached to write the book for the first time then, it would have read as a kind of a triumphant sports memoir. But what happened after that was, several months after that, was the US presidential campaign between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where the debates were hijacked before our eyes, really. And it became not only a symbol for the polarization that had run these rifts through this country where I was living, but also became a mechanism through which that polarization amplified and spread, right? The year after that, I moved to Beijing on a fellowship that was designed to be a kind of a bridge between East and West, China and the US. And halfway through that program, which had begun on this note of optimism, the trade war set in, and the great freeze that we're living in now kind of became our reality. And several months after that, a year after that, I moved back to Australia and became a reporter covering an election that mirrored a lot of the polarized dynamics that I had seen in the US and even in my year in Beijing. And in that time, it became very hard to imagine that disagreement could be anything other than a source of pain and division, and even existential danger in many ways to some political communities. And right as I had in my childhood, I began to feel again the urge to run away from disagreement. And it was really in the search for answers, for something more positive, that this book came about. And I'll end today, my presentation part of today, just by sharing two more lessons that kind of helped me see that perhaps debate could, even in this period of polarization, provide something positive. So here's the third lesson. It's called side switch. So one of the ways to diagnose, I think, our polarized discourse today is that people feel very frozen in place, that opposing positions kind of start to seem unfathomable, unimaginable, right? That you can't even understand why it is they're saying the things that they're saying, what they're believing. And one of the things that I learned in debating was so much of debating is an exercise in certainty, right? It's about knowing your argument, coming up with the best evidence, best arguments to be able to support it, to meet those two burdens, as I talked about before. But in the last 5 minutes before the best debaters go on, they do something quite amazing, which is one of these three exercises. The first is they take out a fresh sheet of paper. They imagine they're now on the other side of the argument, and they try and come up with the best 4 arguments for that position. Or they go through the case that they've just prepared as if through the eyes of an opponent and try and come up with the strongest possible objections to the position. Or they imagine that there's a judge listening to them and they've lost the disagreement. And they ask, if we lost, why would we have lost? Right? And you come up with the reason. And these 3 exercises put forward a particular view of empathy, not as a spontaneous connection that magically arises between 2 people, not as a virtue that you hold, but as something that arises through action. And this is not exactly empathy, because you still don't know what exactly the other person believes, but it creates a wriggle room at a time when it feels like trench warfare and people are frozen in their position. And it's through that wriggle room that I think something like empathy might be able to arise. In debating, you also learn to choose your battles. That within one disagreement, as we spoke about at the beginning of this presentation, there are dozens of disagreements you could be having. And that if cleverness is the ability to argue well, that there's a wisdom in being able to choose which arguments to contest and which to let go. And for the purposes of this book, I came up with a kind of a checklist that says, before entering into a disagreement or engaging in a particular disagreement, you ask whether there is in fact a real disagreement here, as opposed to an imagined slight or just going into it out of defensiveness. You ask whether that's important enough to justify the disagreement, whether the subject of the disagreement is specific enough to be able to make some progress. So you're not debating the virtues of conservatism in all one go, right? Because it's just too big an apple. That you're setting the question in such a term that you're going to be able to make some progress on it. And you're going to check that the 2 sides are aligned in their reasons for wanting to engage in the dispute. That if one person is just in it to hurt their feelings, hurt the other person's feelings, then you might want to defer the conversation or skip it altogether. And so through this kind of a search, I found that there were reasons for hope, but more than that, there was a kind of an avenue through which we could take some action to deal with the way in which polarization makes itself feel real in our lives, which is through disagreements and bad disagreements that we have. And it's from that that this book arose. These are the various covers. It has a different title in the US than in the UK. And the basic structure of the book is I go through the different elements of debate and coach people through it kind of the way that I did or tried to in the seminar. And those elements are knowing the topic, making an argument, rebutting an argument, using rhetoric, speech, and gesture to be able to best persuade people of the strength of an argument, and then choosing your battles. So this is silence. And then I then apply those lessons into arenas or settings in the real world where disagreements feel very urgent and cause a lot of problems for people. And those are disagreements with bad faith actors, right? And I see some of the questions coming in are about those. They're disagreements in our personal relationships. They're disagreements in education and disagreements online and reflections on how technology is changing our culture of argument. So that is the book. And I think I might just leave it there, and I'll try and fold in a couple of the more challenging elements of the project in my answers to people's questions, because I think they're covered by the Q&A. So thanks very much for listening to the presentation. I hope it was helpful. And I look forward to hearing your questions. Dana will help.
Yes, thank you, Bo, so much for that really enlightening presentation. I think the audience interaction, people are really engaged. So if you do have more questions, please put them in the Q&A box, but there are a couple already there. So we'll just go ahead and get started with those. From Gareth, what is the best or favorite debate that you've lost? And what did you take away from that moving forward in your own reflection on arguments?
The one that comes to mind is, I mean, I won this tournament in Thessaloniki, Greece, and the day after, I had a disagreement with my roommate. I'd just flown back to the US, and it was about chores and something to do with the apartment, and it was a way in which I had been thoughtless. And I think I learned kind of two things from it. The first is you're going to lose a lot, right, when you embrace a life of arguing. That there are going to be wins and losses, and sometimes you're going to lose to someone who's not practiced in the art of disagreement in the way that you had imagined yourself to be. So for me, one important part of it was just knowing there will be wins and losses, but that the best we can hope for is to agree in such a way that we're okay with, that being the rules of the game, those being the values by which we play with. And I think the second part of that maybe was that, learning to disagree can take you very far, but it can't substitute for being a good roommate. It can't substitute for being a good colleague. And there's a lot of work on that, of maybe it is just learning, maybe it's exercising compassion, forgiveness. Those are things that may be outside the world of debate that I had to learn. So I think those are the two things. One is that you're going to lose. And I think it's good to know that from the beginning, because it makes it less about individual wins and losses. It's about how we have the conversation. And I think the second is debate is a lot of it, but it's not everything.
The next question comes from Sandy. Regarding the rule of only one person speaking, how would you deal with someone who hogs the dialogue?
It's a wonderful question. I would say two things. The first is when I say every disagreement should start with some agreement, that agreement can be an active process, right? So you can negotiate beforehand. So before we go into a disagreement, you say, okay, I'm willing to have this disagreement with you, but can we agree we're not going to interrupt one another? Or can we agree that if we're going to have a conversation, we should get roughly equal time in which to speak? And so I would ask it like that. And it's kind of a hard question to say no to. If you say, can we roughly talk an equal amount of time, please? The harder thing probably is when you're in the middle of it. And one of the things that I write about in the chapter about bullies is they change the rules in the middle of the game, right? And this is what we often see in those prime ministerial presidential debates, right? Is it starts out in a kind of a structured way, and then it goes haywire. And it's in those times, there are some tactics that I lay out of responding on the spot, but I think the one that works for me most often, I think, is pausing and asking, wait, is this a disagreement with, is this a debate that we're trying to have, or is this something else, right? Are we having a debate, or are we just going to have a shouting match or a brawl? And that opportunity to reset brings back that agreement, right? So that, and once you kind of point out, I think there's a lot of power in naming, and this is becoming a bit of a theme in this talk today, is pointing out that what you're doing is changing the nature of our conversation. So we're not debating anymore, we're brawling. I think that being able to name that and identify that gives us some agency to respond. So I'll give those two suggestions.
From Lisa, what if there are very strong-minded people when you're working in a group, and you know you will meet resistance, and there are more of them than there are people that support your opinion?
That's a wonderful question. I would say two things. So I think the first is on this point about reaching some agreement. Even in especially in a room perhaps where a lot of minds are made up, right? You want to get people to agree that there's no point in having this conversation unless we're going to hear one another out, right? So you could say the whole point of having this disagreement is for us to be able to better understand one another, and can we agree to hear one another out, right? That this won't be a kind of a charade, because you may not be interested in having that disagreement in the first instance, right? I think the second thing related to that is broadening our definition of what winning in an argument is, right? And it may well be that, and I've seen this in workplaces I've been a part of, where it just may not be the case your argument is going to carry the day that day, right? The deck is stacked against you in that way. In that instance, I think there are still many good reasons to engage in disagreement. It may be just to get your point heard, so that you may be able to refer it back to it in the future. It may be so that you get slight concessions in where the other side is at. Maybe you find a third solution together, right? So it's I say A, you say B. It often ends up in C through the process of argument. So I think in that instance, coming at it with a clear sense of what a win might be for you, that is short of persuading all, 12 angry men kind of scenario. I think that often helps me in those settings as well. And that it may not be always, the ideal takeaway, but I think there are ways in which a disagreement can be useful and constructive, even where the end result is not a total conversion of the people who disagree with you.
Sort of along the same lines, Anne asks, what if you are persuaded to the other side during the debate by points you hadn't previously considered?
I love that. I think that's one of the most amazing things that can happen, because yeah, I mean, my friend just gave birth to a kid, and it's hard to see growth in real time. But sometimes you feel it in a conversation. And in many instances, you can say that, right? And that's one of the luxuries of being not a pundit on live television, whose livelihood depends on parroting a certain view. You can change your mind. I think that's one. I think another, though, is, often it's the case that people don't change their minds in the middle of a debate, but often they do in reflecting upon the debate. Because for that period of 2 hours, it is kind of adrenaline flowing. There's a bit of loss of ego if you say what I just did and just, oh, I'm actually persuaded of that, So you can spend those 2 hours just fully persuaded and hashing out that argument. But in the quiet and still hours afterwards, there may be a slight shift. And actually, I think this is a concept that children take to very instinctively. So after a debate, if you've ever seen, your children, or you have kids near you who are debaters, they'll, fight it out. You're so wrong, I'm so right, for 2 hours. And then on the bus ride home, one of them will turn to their former opponent and say, you had a point there, or maybe that part was right. And the reason why that gives me a lot of joy and hope is that the game of debate served some use, right? It generated a lot of ideas. It exposed you to so many things, and you didn't concede anything on the spot, maybe, but you've changed in some way through that encounter. And I think that comes with allowing the debate to end.
I think that's a great place to end, a very hopeful place to end. Thank you both so much for this evening, for joining us, and thank you everyone at home for watching and being so interactive. I think this was a great presentation, a great hour seminar, and we hope to have you join us again in the future. You can reach us at howtoacademy.com. You can listen to our podcast. You can sign up to our newsletter. But thank you again, Bo, so much for this evening, and please, everyone, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks so much.